Chapter 36 of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Fight in the Tunnels. For some time this strange party of refugees from an outraged world walked in silence. Because of their size, the tunnel appeared to them now not more than 8 or 9 feet in height, and in most places of nearly similar width. For perhaps 10 minutes no one spoke, except an occasional monosyllable. The Chemist and Big Business Man, walking abreast, were leading. Aura and Lylda, with the Very Young Man, and Loto close in front of them, brought up the rear. The tunnel they were traversing appeared quite deserted. Only once, at the intersection of another smaller passageway, a few little figures, not more than a foot high, scurried past and hastily disappeared. Once the party stopped for half an hour to rest. "I don't think we'll have any trouble getting through," said the Chemist. "The tunnels are usually deserted at this time of sleep." The Big Business Man appeared not so sanguine, but said nothing. Finally they came to one of the large amphitheaters into which several of the tunnels opened. Its size, it appeared to them now, 100 feet in length, and with a roof some 12 feet high. The Chemist stopped to let the others come up. "I think our best route is there," he pointed. "It's not so high a tunnel. We shall have to get smaller. Beyond it they are larger again. It is not far, half an hour perhaps, walking as we—" A cry from Aura interrupted him. "My brother, see, they come!" she exclaimed. Before them, out of several of the smaller passageways, a crowd of little figures was pouring. There were no shouts, there was seemingly no confusion, just a steady flowing stream of human forms emptying from the tunnels into the amphitheater and spreading out over its open surface. The fugitives stared a moment in horror. "Good God, they've got us!" the Doctor muttered, breaking the tenseness of the silence. The little people kept their distance at first, and then as the open space filled up, slowly they began coming closer, in little waves of movement, irresistible as an incoming tide. Aura turned toward the passageway through which they had entered. "We can go back," she said, and then, "No, see, they come there too." A crowd of little gray figures blocked that entrance also. A crowd that hesitated an instant and then came forward, spreading out fan shape as it came. The Big Business Man doubled up his fists. "It's fight," he said grimly. "By God, we'll—" But Lylda, with a low cry, flung herself before him. "No, no," she said passionately. "Not that. It cannot be that now, just at the last—" Aura laid a hand upon her sister's shoulder. "Wait, my sister," she said gently. "There is no matter of justice here for you, a woman, to decide. This is for men to deal with, a matter for men, our men. And what they say to do, that must be done." She turned to the Chemist and the Very Young Man, who were standing side by side. "A woman cannot kill," she said slowly, "unless her man says it so, or if to save him." Her eyes flashed fire. She held her slim little body erect and rigid, an Amazon ready to fight to the death for those she loved. The Chemist hesitated a moment. Before he could answer, a single shrill cry sounded from somewhere out in the silent, menacing throng. As though at a signal, 1,000 little voices took it up, and with a great rush the crowd swept forward. In the first moment of surprise and indecision, the group of fugitives stood motionless. As the wave of little struggling human forms closed in around them, the Very Young Man came to himself with a start. He looked down. They were black around him now, swaying back and forth about his legs. Most of them were men, armed with the short, broad-bladed swords, or with smaller knives. Some brandished other improvised weapons. Still others held rocks in their hands. A pair of little arms clutched the Very Young Man about his leg. He gave a violent kick, scattering a number of the struggling figures and clearing a space into which he leaped. "Back, Aura, Lylda!" he shouted. "Take Loto and Eena. Get back behind us!" The Big Business Man, kicking violently, and sometimes stooping down to sweep the ground with great swings of his arm, had cleared a space before them. Taking Loto, who looked on with frightened eyes, the three women stepped back against the side wall of the amphitheater. The Very Young Man swiftly discarded his robe, standing in the knitted undersuit in which he had swam the lake. The other men followed his example. For 10 minutes or more, in ceaseless waves, the little creatures threw themselves forward and were beaten back. The confined space echoed with their shouts and with the cries of the wounded. The 5 men fought silently. Once the Doctor stumbled and fell. Before his friends could get to him, his body was covered with his foes. When he got back upon his feet, knocking them off, he was bleeding profusely from an ugly looking wound in his shoulder. "Good God!" he panted, as the Chemist and the Big Business Man leaped over to him. "They'll get us if we go down." "We can get larger," said the Big Business Man, pointing upwards to the roof overhead. "Larger, and then " He swayed a trifle, breathing hard. His legs were covered with blood from a dozen wounds. Oteo, fighting back and forth before them, was holding the crowd in check. A heap of dead lay in a semicircle in front of him. "I'm going across," shouted the Very Young Man suddenly, and began striding forward into the struggling mass. The crowd, thus diverted, eased its attack for a moment. Slowly the Very Young Man waded into it. He was perhaps 50 feet out from the side wall when a stone struck him upon the temple. He went down, out of sight in the seething mass. "Come on!" shouted the Big Business Man. But before he could move, Aura dashed past him, fighting her way out to where the Very Young Man lay. In a moment she was beside him. Her fragile body seemed hopelessly inadequate for such a struggle, but the spirit within her made her fight like a wildcat. Catching one of the little figures by the legs, she flung him about like a club, knocking a score of the others back and clearing a space about the Very Young Man. Then abruptly she dropped her victim and knelt down, plucking away the last of the attacking figures who was hacking at the Very Young Man's arm with his sword. The Chemist and Big Business Man were beside her now, and together they carried the Very Young Man back. He had recovered consciousness and smiled up at them feebly. They laid him on the ground against the wall, and Aura sat beside him. "Gosh, I'm all right," he said, waving them away. "Be with you in a minute. Give 'em hell." The Doctor knelt beside the Very Young Man for a moment, and finding he was not seriously hurt, left him and rejoined the Chemist and Big Business Man, who, with Oteo, had forced the struggling mass of little figures some distance away. "I'm going to get larger," shouted the Big Business Man a moment later. "Wipe them all out, damn it. I can do it. We can't keep on this way." The Doctor was by his side. "You can't do it. Isn't room," he shouted in answer, pausing as he waved one of his assailants in the air above his head. "You might take too much." The Big Business Man was reaching with one hand under his robe. With his feet he kicked violently to keep the space about him clear. A tiny stone flew by his head, another struck him on the chest, and all at once he realized that he was bruised all over from where other stones had been hitting him. He looked across to the opposite wall of the amphitheater. Through the tunnel entrance there he saw that the stream of little people was flowing the other way now. They were trying to get out instead of pouring in. The Big Business Man waved his arms. "They're running away. Look!" he shouted. "They're running over there. Come on!" He dashed forward, and followed by his companions, redoubled his efforts. The crowd wavered, the shouting grew less, those further away began running back. Then suddenly a shrill cry arose. Just a single little voice it was at first. After a moment others took it up, and still others, until it sounded from every side. Three Oroid words, repeated over and over. The Chemist abruptly stopped fighting. "It's done!" he shouted. "Thank God it's over!" The cry continued. The little figures had ceased attacking now, and were struggling in a frenzy to get through the tunnels. "No more!" shouted the Chemist. "They're going! See them going! Stop!" His companions stood by his side, panting and weak from loss of blood. The Chemist tried to smile. His face was livid. He swayed unsteadily on his feet. "No more," he repeated. "It's over. Thank God it's over!" Meanwhile the Very Young Man, lying on the floor with Aura sitting beside him, revived a little. He tried to sit up after a few moments, but the girl pulled him down. "But I've got to go. Give him hell," he protested weakly. His head was still confused. He only knew he should be back fighting beside his friends. "Not yet," Aura said gently. "There is no need yet. When there is, you may trust me, Jack. I shall say it." The Very Young Man closed his eyes. The blurred iridescent outlines of the rocks confused him. His head was ringing. The girl put an arm under his neck. He found one of her hands and held it tightly. For a moment he lay silent. Then his head seemed to clear a little. He opened his eyes. "What are they doing now, Aura?" he asked. "It's no different," the girl answered softly. "So terrible a thing so terrible," she finished, almost to herself. "I'll wait just a minute more," he murmured, and closed his eyes again. He held the girl's hand tighter. He seemed to be floating away, and her hand steadied him. The sounds of the fighting sounded very distant now, all blurred and confused and dreamlike. Only the girl's nearness seemed real, the touch of her little body against his as she sat beside him. "Aura," he whispered. "Aura." She put her face down to his. "Yes, Jack," she answered gently. "It's very bad there, don't you think?" She did not answer. "I was just thinking," he went on. He spoke slowly, almost in a whisper. "Maybe you know we won't come through this." He paused. His thoughts somehow seemed too big to put into words, but he knew he was very happy. "I was just thinking, Aura, that if we shouldn't come through, I just wanted you to know " Again he stopped. From far away he heard the shrill, rhythmic cry of many voices shouting in unison. He listened, and then it all came back. The battle, his friends there fighting. They needed him. He let go of the girl's hand and sat up, brushing back his moist hair. "Listen, Aura. Hear them shouting? I mustn't stay here." He tried weakly to get upon his feet, but the girl's arm about his waist held him down. "Wait," she said. Surprised by the tenseness of her tone, he relaxed. The cry grew louder, rolling up from 1,000 voices and echoing back and forth across the amphitheater. The Very Young Man wondered vaguely what it could mean. He looked into Aura's face. Her lips were smiling now. "What is it, Aura?" he whispered. The girl impulsively put her arms about him and held him close. "But we are coming through, my friend Jack. We are coming through." The Very Young Man looked wonderingly into her eyes. "Don't you hear? The cry of fear and despair. It means life to us, and no more death to them." The Chemist's voice came out of the distance, shouting, "They're running away. It's over. Thank God it's over." Then the Very Young Man knew, and life opened up before him again. "Life," he whispered to himself. "Life and love and happiness." End of chapter 36. Of the Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Combat of Titans. In a few minutes the amphitheater was entirely clear, save for the dead and maimed little figures lying scattered about it. But it was nearly an hour more before the fugitives were ready to resume their journey. The attack had come so suddenly and had demanded such immediate and continuous action that none of the men, with the exception of the Very Young Man, had had time to realize how desperate was the situation in which they had fallen. With the almost equally abrupt cessation of the struggle there came the inevitable reaction. The men, bleeding from a score of wounds, weak from loss of blood, and sick from the memory of the things they had been compelled to do, threw themselves upon the ground, utterly exhausted. "We must get out of here," said the Doctor, after they had been lying quiet for a time, with the strident shrieks of hundreds of the dying little creatures sounding in their ears. That was pretty near the end. "It isn't far," the Chemist answered, "when we get started." "We must get water," the Doctor went on. "These cuts—" They had used nearly all their drinking water washing out their wounds, which Aura and Lylda had bound up with strips of cloth torn from their garments. The Chemist got upon his feet. "There's no water nearer than the forest river," he said. "That tunnel over there comes out very near it." "What makes you think we won't have another scrap getting out?" the Very Young Man wanted to know. He had entirely recovered from the effects of the stone that had struck him on the temple, and was in better condition than any of the other men. "I'm sure," the Chemist said confidently. "They were through. They will not attack us again for some time at least. The tunnels will be deserted." The Big Business Man stood up also. "We'd better get going while we have the chance," he said. "This getting smaller, I don't like it." They started soon after, and true to the Chemist's prediction, met no further obstacle to their safe passage through the tunnels. When they had reached the forest above, none of the little people were in sight. The Big Business Man heaved a long sigh of relief. "Thank goodness we're here at last," he said. "I didn't realize how good these woods would look." In a few minutes more they were at the edge of the river, bathing their wounds in its cooling water and replenishing their drinking bottles. "How do we get across?" the Very Young Man asked. "We won't have to cross it," the Chemist answered with a smile. "The tunnel took us under." "Let's eat here," the Very Young Man suggested, "and take a sleep. We're about all in." "We ought to get larger first," protested the Big Business Man. They were at this time about 4 times Oroid's size. The forest trees, so huge when they last had seen them, now seemed only rather large saplings. "Some one of us must stay awake," the Doctor said. "But there do not seem to be any Oroids up here." "What do they come up here for anyway?" asked the Very Young Man. "There's some hunting," the Chemist answered, "but principally it's the mines beyond in the desert." They agreed finally to stop beside the river and eat another meal, and then, with one of them on guard, to sleep for a time before continuing their journey. The meal, at the Doctor's insistence, was frugal to the extreme, and was soon over. They selected Oteo to stand guard first. The youth, when he understood what was intended, pleaded so with his master that the Chemist agreed. Utterly worn out, the travelers lay down on a mossy bank at the river's edge, and in a few moments were all fast asleep. Oteo sat near by with his back against a tree trunk. Occasionally he got up and walked to and fro to fight off the drowsiness that came over him. How long the Very Young Man slept he never knew. He slept dreamlessly for a considerable time. When he struggled back to consciousness, it was with a curious feeling of detachment, as though his mind no longer was connected with his body. He thought first of Aura, with a calm, peaceful sense of happiness. For a long time he lay, drifting along with his thoughts and wondering whether he were asleep or awake. Then all at once he knew he was not asleep. His eyes were open. Before him stood the forest trees at the river's edge. At the foot of one of the trees he could see the figure of Oteo, sitting hunched up with his head upon his hands, fast asleep. Remembrance came to the Very Young Man, and he sat up with a start. Beside him his friends lay motionless. He looked around, still a little confused, and then his heart leaped into his throat, for at the edge of the woods he saw a small, lean, gray figure, the little figure of a man who stood against a tree trunk. The man's face was turned towards him. He met the glistening eyes looking down, and saw the lips parted in a leering smile. A thrill of fear ran over the Very Young Man as he recognized the face of Targo. And then his heart seemed to stop beating, for as he stared, fascinated, into the man's mocking eyes, he saw that slowly, steadily, he was growing larger. Mechanically the Very Young Man's hand went to his armpit, his fingers fumbling at the pouch strapped underneath. The vial of chemicals was not there. For an instant more the Very Young Man continued staring, then with an effort he turned his eyes away from the gaze that seemed to hypnotize him. Beside him the Chemist lay sleeping. He looked back at Targo and saw him larger, almost as large now as he was himself. Like a cloak discarded, the Very Young Man's bewilderment dropped from him. He recognized the danger, realized that in another moment this enemy would be irresistibly powerful, invincible. His mind was clear now, his nerves steady, his muscles tense. He knew the only thing he could do. He calculated the chances in a flash of thought. Still staring at the triumphant face of Targo, the Very Young Man jumped to his feet and swiftly bent over the sleeping form of the Chemist. Reaching through the neck of his robe, he took out the vial of chemicals, and before his friend was fairly awake, had swallowed one of the pills. As the Very Young Man sprang into action, Targo turned and ran swiftly away, perhaps 100 feet. Then again he stopped and stood watching his intended victim with his sardonic smile. The Very Young Man met the Chemist's startled eyes. "Targo," said the Very Young Man swiftly, "he's here. He stole the drug just now while I was sleeping." The Chemist opened his mouth to reply, but the Very Young Man bounded away. He could feel the drug beginning to work. The ground under his feet swayed unsteadily. Swiftly he ran straight towards the figure of Targo, where he stood leaning against a tree. His enemy did not move to run away, but stood quietly awaiting him. The Very Young Man saw he was now nearly the same size that Targo was, if anything, the larger. A fallen tree separated them. The Very Young Man cleared it with a bound. Still Targo stood motionless, awaiting his onslaught. Then abruptly he stooped to the ground, and a rock whistled through the air, narrowly missing the Very Young Man's head. Before Targo could recover from the throw, the Very Young Man was upon him, and they went down together. Back and forth over the soft ground they rolled, first one on top, then the other. The Very Young Man's hand found a stone on the ground beside them. His fingers clutched it. He raised it above him, but a blow upon his forearm knocked it away before he could strike, and a sudden twist of his antagonist's body rolled him over and pinned him upon his back. The Very Young Man thought of his encounter with Targo before, and again with sinking heart he realized he was the weaker of the two. He jerked one of his wrists free, and striking upwards with all his force, landed full on his enemy's jaw. The man's head snapped back, but he laughed, a grim, sardonic laugh that ended in a half growl, like a wild beast enraged. The Very Young Man's blood ran cold. A sudden frenzy seized him. He put all his strength into one desperate lunge, and, wrenching himself free, sprang to his feet. Targo was up almost as quickly as he, and for an instant the two stood eyeing each other, breathing hard. At the Very Young Man's feet a little stream was flowing past. Vaguely he found himself thinking how peaceful it looked, how cool and soothing the water would be to his bruised and aching body. Beside the stream his eyes caught a number of tiny human figures standing close together, looking up at him, little forms that a single sweep of his foot would have scattered and killed. A shiver of fear ran across him as in a flash he realized this other danger. With a cry he leaped sideways away from the water. Beside him stood a little tree whose bushy top hardly reached his waist. He clutched its trunk with both hands and jerking it from the ground, swung it at his enemy's head, meeting him just as he sprang forward. The tree struck Targo a glancing blow upon the shoulder. With another laugh he grasped its roots and twisted it from the Very Young Man's hand. A second more, and they came together again, and the Very Young Man felt his antagonist's powerful arms around his body, bending him backwards. The Big Business Man stood beside the others at the river's edge, watching the gigantic struggle, the outcome of which meant life or death to them all. The grappling figures were 10 times his own height before he fairly realized the situation. At first he thought he should take some of the drug also and grow larger with them. Then he knew that he could not overtake their growth in time to aid his friend. The Chemist and the Doctor must evidently have reached the same conclusion, for they, too, did nothing, only stood motionless, speechless, staring up at the battling giants. Loto, with his head buried upon his mother's shoulder and her arms holding him close, whimpered a little in terror. Only Aura, of all the party, did not get upon her feet. She lay full length upon the ground, a hand under her chin, staring steadily upwards. Her face was expressionless, her eyes unblinking, but her lips moved a little, as though she were breathing a silent prayer, and the fingers of her hand against her face dug their nails into the flesh of her cheek. Taller far than the treetops, the two giants stood facing each other. Then the Very Young Man seized one of the trees, and with a mighty pull tore it up by the roots and swung it through the air. Aura drew a quick breath as in another instant they grappled and came crashing to the ground, falling head and shoulders in the river with a splash that drenched her with its spray. The Very Young Man was underneath, and she seemed to meet the glance of his great eyes when he fell. The trees growing on the river bank snapped like rushes beneath the huge bodies of the giants, as, still growing larger, they struggled back and forth. The river, stirred into turmoil by the sweep of their great arms, rolled its waves up over the mossy banks, driving the watchers back into the edge of the woods, and even there covering them with its spray. A moment more and the giants were on their feet again, standing ankle deep far out in the river. Up against the unbroken blackness of the starless sky their huge forms towered. For a second they stood motionless, then they came together again, and Aura could see the Very Young Man sink on his knees, his hand trailing in the water. Then in an instant more he struggled up to his feet, and as his hand left the water Aura saw that it clutched an enormous dripping rock. She held her breath, watching the tremendous figures as they swayed, locked in each other's arms. A single step sideways and they were back nearly at the river's bank. The water seethed white under their tread. The Very Young Man's right arm hung limp behind him. The boulder in his hand dangled 100 feet or more in the air above the water. Slowly the greater strength of his antagonist bent him backwards. Aura's heart stood still as she saw Targo's fingers at the Very Young Man's throat. Then in a great arc the Very Young Man swept his hand holding the rock over his head and brought it down full upon his enemy's skull. The boulder fell into the river with a thundering splash. For a brief instant the giant figures hung swaying, then the titanic hulk of Targo's body came crashing down. It fell full across the river, quivered convulsively, and lay still. And the river, backing up before it a moment, turned aside in its course, and then flung the muddy torrent of its water roaring down through the forest. End of chapter 37. of the Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lost in Sighs. The Very Young Man stood ankle deep in the turgid little rivulet, a tightness clutching at his chest and with his head whirling. At his feet his antagonist lay motionless. He stepped out of the water, putting his foot into a tiny grove of trees that bent and crackled like twigs under his tread. He wondered if he would faint. He knew he must not. Away to the left he saw a line of tiny hills, beyond that a luminous obscurity into which his sight could not penetrate. Behind him there was only darkness. He seemed to be standing in the midst of a great barren waste, with just a little toy river and forest at his feet, a child's plaything set down in a man's great desert. The Very Young Man suddenly thought of his friends. He stepped into the middle of the river and out again on the other side. Then he bent down with his face close to the ground, just above the tops of the tiny little trees. He made the human figures out finally. Hardly larger than ants they seemed, and he shuddered as he saw them. The end of his thumb could have smashed them all, they were so small. One of the figures seemed to be waving something, and the Very Young Man thought he heard the squeak of its voice. He straightened upright, standing rigid, afraid to move his feet. He wondered what he should do, and in sudden fear felt for the vial of the diminishing drug. It was still in place, in the pouch under his armpit. The Very Young Man breathed a sigh of relief. He decided to take the drug and rejoin his friends. Then, as a sudden thought struck him, he bent down to the ground again, slowly, with infinite caution. The little figures were still there, and now he thought they were not quite as tiny as before. He watched them. Slowly but unmistakably they were growing larger. The Very Young Man carefully took a step backwards, and then sat down heavily. The forest trees crackled under him. He pulled up his knees and rested his head upon them. The little rivulet, diverted from its course by the body of Targo, swept past through the woods almost at his side. The noise it made mingled with the ringing in his head. His body ached all over. He closed his eyes. "He's all right now," the doctor's voice said. "He'll be all right in a moment." The Very Young Man opened his eyes. He was lying upon the ground, with Aura sitting beside him, and his friends, all his own size again, standing over him. He met Aura's tender, serious eyes and smiled. "I'm all right," he said. "What a foolish thing to faint." Lylda stooped beside him. "You saved us all," she said. "There is nothing we can say to mean what it should, but you will always know how we feel, how splendid you were." To the praise they gave him the Very Young Man had no answer save a smile of embarrassment. Aura said nothing, only met his smile with one of her own, and with a tender glance that made his heart beat faster. "I'm all right," he repeated after a moment of silence. "Let's get started." They sat down now beside the Very Young Man and earnestly discussed the best plan for getting out of the ring. "You said you had calculated the best way," suggested the Doctor to the Chemist. "First of all," interrupted the Big Business Man, "are we sure none of these Oroids is going to follow us? For heaven's sake, let's have done with these terrible struggles." The Very Young Man remembered. "He stole one of the vials," he said, pointing to Targo's body. He was probably alone, the Chemist reasoned. If any other had been with him they would have taken some of the drug also. Probably Targo took one of the pills and then dropped the vial to the ground. "My idea," pursued the Big Business Man, "is for us to get large just as quickly and continuously as possible. Probably you're right about Targo, but don't let's take any chances. I've been thinking," he continued, seeing that they agreed with him. "You know this is a curious problem we have facing us. I've been thinking about it a lot. It seemed a frightful long trip down here, but in spite of that I can't get it out of my mind that we're only a very little distance under the surface of the ring." "It's absolutely all in the viewpoint," the Chemist said with a smile. "That's what I meant about having an easier method of getting out. The distance depends absolutely on how you view it." "How far would it be out if we didn't get any larger?" the Very Young Man wanted to know. "Based on the size of a normal Oroid adult, and using the terrestrial standard of feet and inches, as they would seem to us when Oroid size, I should say the distance from Arite to the surface of the ring would be about 150 to 160,000 miles." "Holy mackerel!" exclaimed the Very Young Man. "Don't let's do much walking while we're small." "You have the idea exactly," smiled the Chemist. "Taking the other viewpoint," said the Doctor, "just where do you figure this Oroid universe is located in the ring?" "It's contained within one of the atoms of gold," the Chemist answered. "And that golden atom, I estimate, is located probably within 1/100th of an inch, possibly even 1/1000th of an inch, away from the circular indentation I made in the bottom of the scratch. In actual distance, I suppose, Arite is possibly 1/16th of an inch below the surface of the ring." "Certainly makes a difference how you look at it," murmured the Very Young Man in awe. The Chemist went on. "It is obvious, then, that although when coming down the distance must be covered to some extent by physical movement, by traveling geographically, so to speak, going back, that is not altogether the case. Most of the distance may be covered by bodily growth rather than by a movement of the body from place to place." "We might get lost," objected the Very Young Man. "Suppose we got started in the wrong direction?" "Coming in, that is a grave danger," answered the Chemist, "because then distances are opening up, and a single false step means many miles of error later on. But going out, just the reverse is true. Distances are shortening. A mile in the wrong direction is corrected in an instant later on. Not coming to a realization of that when I made the trip before, led me to undertake many unnecessary hours of most arduous climbing. There is only one condition imperative. The body growing must have free space for its growth, or it will be crushed to death." "Have you planned exactly how we are to get out?" asked the Big Business Man. "Yes, I have," the Chemist answered. "In the size we are now, which you must remember is several thousand times Oroid height, it will be only a short distance to a point where, as we grow, we can move gradually to the center of the circular pit. That huge inclined plane slides down out of it. You remember, once in the pit, with its walls closing in upon us, we can at the proper moment get out of it about as I did before." "Then we'll be in the Valley of the Scratch," exclaimed the Very Young Man eagerly. "I'll certainly be glad to get back there again." "Getting out of the valley will use the same method," the Chemist continued. "There we shall have to do some climbing, but not nearly so much as I did." The Very Young Man was thrilled at the prospect of so speedy a return to his own world. "Let's get going," he suggested quickly. "It sounds a cinch." They started away in a few minutes more, leaving the body of Targo lying where it had fallen across the river. In half an hour of walking they located without difficulty the huge incline down which the Chemist had fallen when he first came into the ring. Following along the bottom of the incline, they reached his landing place, a mass of small rocks and pebbles of a different metallic looking stone than the ground around, marking it plainly. These were the rocks and boulders that had been brought down with him in his fall. "From here," said the Chemist as they came to a halt, "we can go up into the valley by growth alone. It is several hours, but we need move very little from this position." "How about eating?" suggested the Very Young Man. They sat down at the base of the incline and ate another meal, rather a more lavish one this time, for the rest they had taken and the prospect of a shorter journey ahead of them than they had anticipated made the doctor less strict. Then, the meal over, they took the amount of the drug the Chemist specified. He measured it carefully. More than 10 of the pills. "We have a long wait," the Chemist said, when the first sickness from this tremendous dose had left them. The time passed quickly. They spoke seldom, for the extraordinary rapidity with which the aspect of the landscape was changing, and the remarkable sensations they experienced, absorbed all their attention. In about 2 hours after taking the drug, the curving, luminous line that was the upper edge of the incline came into view, faint and blurred, but still distinct against the blackness of the sky. The incline now was noticeably steeper. Each moment they saw its top coming down towards them out of the height above, and its surface smoothing out and becoming more nearly perpendicular. They were all standing up now. The ground beneath them seemed in rapid motion, coming towards them from all directions and dwindling away beneath their feet. The incline, too, now in form a vertical concave wall, kept shoving itself forward, and they had to step backwards continually to avoid its thrust. Within another hour a similar concave wall appeared behind them, which they could follow with their eyes entirely around the circumference of the great pit in which they now found themselves. The sides of this pit soon became completely perpendicular, smooth and shining. Another hour, and the action of the drug was beginning to slacken. The walls encircling them, although steadily closing in, no longer seemed to move with such rapidity. The pit, as they saw it now, was perhaps 1,000 feet in diameter and twice as deep. Far overhead the blackness of the sky was beginning to be tinged with a faint gray blue. At the Chemist's suggestion, they walked over near the center of the circular enclosure. Slowly its walls closed in about them. An hour more, and its diameter was scarcely 50 feet. The Chemist called his companions around him. "There is an obstacle here," he began, "that we can easily overcome, but we must all understand just what we are to do. In perhaps half an hour, at the rate we are growing, this enclosure will resemble a well, twice as deep, approximately, as it is broad. We cannot climb up its sides, therefore we must wait until it is not more than 6 feet in depth in order to be able to get out. At that time its diameter will be scarcely 3 feet. There are 9 of us here. You can realize there would not be room for us all. What we must do is very simple. Since there is not room for us all at once, we must get larger from now on, only one at a time." "Quite so," said the Big Business Man in a perfectly matter-of-fact tone. "All of us but one will stop growing now. One will go on and get out of the pit. He will immediately stop his growth so that he can wait for the others and help them out. Each of us will follow the same method of procedure." The Chemist then went on to arrange the exact quantity of the drugs they were each to take at specified times, so that at the end they would all be nearly the same size again. When he explained all this to Oteo and Eena in their native language, they were ready to proceed with the plan. "Who's first?" asked the Very Young Man. "Let me go with Loto." They selected the Chemist to go first, and all but him took a little of the other drug and checked their growth. The pit at this time was hardly more than 15 feet across and about 30 feet deep. The Chemist stood in the center of the enclosure, while his friends crowded over against its walls to make room for his growing body. It was nearly half an hour before his head was above its top. He waited only a moment more, then he sprang upwards, clambered out of the pit, and disappeared beyond the rim. In a few moments they saw his huge head and shoulders hanging over the side wall, his hand and arm reached down towards them, and they heard his great voice roaring, "Come on, somebody else!" The Very Young Man went next with Loto. Nothing unusual marked their growth, and without difficulty, helped by the Chemist's hands reaching down to them, they climbed out of the pit. In an hour more the entire party was in the valley, standing beside the little circular opening out of which they had come. The Very Young Man found himself beside Aura, a little apart from the others, who gathered to discuss their plan for growing out of the valley. "It isn't much of a trip, is it, Aura?" the Very Young Man said. "Do you realize we're nearly there?" The girl looked around her curiously. The valley of the Scratch appeared to them now hardly more than a quarter of a mile in width. Aura stared upwards between its narrow walls to where, several thousand feet above, a narrow strip of gray blue sky was visible. "That sky, is that the sky of your world?" she exclaimed. "How pretty it is!" The Very Young Man laughed. "No, Aura, that's not our sky. It's only the space in the room above the ring. When we get the size we are going to be finally, our heads will be right up in there. The real sky with its stars will be even then as far above us as your sky at Arite was above you." Aura breathed a long sigh. "It's too wonderful really to understand, isn't it?" she said. The Very Young Man pulled her down on the ground beside him. "The most wonderful part, Aura, is going to be having you up there." He spoke gently. Somehow, whenever he thought of this fragile little girl woman up in his strange, bustling world, he felt himself very big and strong. He wanted to be her protector and her teacher of all the new and curious things she must learn. The girl did not reply at once. She simply met his earnest gaze with her frank, answering smile of understanding. The Chemist was calling to them. "Oh, you Jack, we're about ready to start." The Very Young Man got to his feet, holding down his hands to help Aura up. "You're going to make a fine woman, Aura, in this new world. You just wait and see if you don't," he said as they rejoined the others. The Chemist explained his plans to them. "This valley is several times deeper than its breadth. You can see that. We cannot grow large enough to jump out as we did out of the pit. We would be crushed by the walls before we were sufficiently tall to leap out. But we're not going to do as I did and climb all the way up. Instead, we will stay here at the bottom until we are as large as we can conveniently get between the valley walls. Then we will stop growing and climb up the side. It will be only a short distance then." The Very Young Man nodded his comprehension. "Unless by that time the walls are too smooth to climb up," he remarked. "If we see them getting too smooth, we'll stop and begin climbing," the Chemist agreed. "We're all ready, aren't we?" He began measuring out the estimated quantities of the drug, handing it to each of them. "Say, I'm terrible sorry," began the Very Young Man apologetically, interrupting this procedure. "But you know, if it wasn't for me, we'd all starve to death." It was several hours since they had eaten last, and all of them were hungry, although the excitement of their strange journey had kept them from realizing it. They ate, "the last meal in the ring," as the Big Business Man put it, and in half an hour more they were ready to start. When they had reached a size where it seemed desirable again to stop growing, the valley resembled a narrow cañon, hardly more than a deep rift in the ground. They were still standing on its floor. Above them, parallel edges of the rift marked the surface of the ring. The side walls of the cañon were smooth, but there were still many places where they could climb out without much difficulty. They started up a narrow declivity along the cañon face. The Chemist led the way. The Very Young Man, with Aura just in front of him, was last. They had been walking only a moment when the Chemist called back over his shoulder. "It's getting very narrow. We'd better stop here and take the drug." The Chemist had reached a rocky shelf, a ledge some 20 feet square that jutted out from the cañon wall. They gathered upon it and took enough of the diminishing drug to stop their growth. Then the Chemist again started forward, but very soon after a cry of alarm from Aura stopped him. The party turned in confusion and crowded back. Aura, pale and trembling, was standing on the very brink of the ledge looking down. The Very Young Man had disappeared. The Big Business Man ran to the brink. "Did he fall? Where is he? I don't see him." They gathered in confusion about the girl. "No," she said. "He just a moment ago was here." "He couldn't have fallen," the Doctor exclaimed. "It isn't far down there. We'd see him." The truth suddenly dawned on the Doctor. "Don't move," he commanded sharply. "Don't any of you move. Don't take a step." Uncomprehending, they stood motionless. The Doctor's gaze was at the rocky floor under his feet. "It's size," he added vehemently. "Don't you understand? He's taken too much of the diminishing drug." An exclamation from Oteo made them all move toward him, in spite of the Doctor's command. There, close by Oteo's feet, they saw the tiny figure of the Very Young Man, already no more than an inch in height, and rapidly growing smaller. The Doctor bent down, and the little figure waved its arms in terror. "Don't get smaller," called the Doctor, but even as he said it he realized it was a futile command. The Very Young Man answered in a voice so minute it seemed coming from an infinite distance. "I can't stop. I haven't any of the other drug." They all remembered then. Targo had stolen the Very Young Man's vial of the enlarging drug. It had never been replaced. Instead, the Very Young Man had been borrowing from the others as he went along. The Big Business Man was seized with sudden panic. "He'll get lost. We must get smaller with him." He turned sideways and, stumbling over a rock, almost crushed the Very Young Man with the step he took to recover his balance. Aura, with a cry, pushed several of the others back. Oteo and Eena, frightened, stared down the declivity. "We must get smaller," the Big Business Man reiterated. The panic was growing among them all. Above their excited cries the Doctor's voice rose. "Stand still, all of you. If we move even a few steps we can never get small and hope to find him." The Doctor himself, too confused to know whether he should take the diminishing drug at once or not, was bending over the ground, and as he watched, fascinated, the Very Young Man's figure dwindled beyond the vanishing point and was gone. End of chapter 38. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A modern dinosaur. The Very Young Man never knew quite how it happened. The Doctor had told them to check their growth, and he took the drug abstractedly, for his mind was on Aura and how she would feel coming for the first time into this great outer world. What quantity he took, the Very Young Man afterward could never decide. But the next thing he knew, the figures of his companions had grown to gigantic size. The rocks about him were expanding enormously. Already he had lost the contour of the ledge. The cañon wall had drawn back almost out of sight in the haze of the distance. He turned around bewildered. There was no precipice behind him. Instead, a great rocky plain tumbling with a mass of boulders, and broken by seams and rifts, spread out to his gaze. And even in that instant, as he regarded it in confusion, it opened up to greater distances. Near at hand, 100 yards away perhaps, a gigantic human figure towered 500 feet into the air. Around it, further away, others equally large were blurred into the haze of distance. The nearer figure stooped, and the Very Young Man, fearful that he might be crushed by its movement, waved his arms in terror. He started to run, leaping over the jagged ground beneath his feet. A great roaring voice From above came down to him the doctor's voice. "Don't get smaller." The Very Young Man stopped running, more frightened than ever before with the realization that came to him. He shouted upward, "I can't stop. I haven't any of the other drug." An enormous blurred object came swooping towards him and went past with a rush of wind, the foot of the Big Business Man, though the Very Young Man did not know it. Above him now the air was filled with roaring, the excited voices of his friends. A few moments passed while the Very Young Man stood stock still, too frightened to move. The roaring above gradually ceased. The towering figures expanded, faded back into the distance, disappeared. The Very Young Man was alone in the silence and desolation of a jagged, broken landscape that was still expanding beneath him. For some time he stood there bewildered. He came to himself suddenly with the thought that although he was too small to be seen by his friends, yet they must be there still within a few steps of him. They might take a step, might crush him to death without seeing him, or knowing that they had done it. There were rocky buttes and hills all about him now. Without stopping to reason what he was doing, he began to run. He did not know or care where, anywhere away from those colossal figures who with a single step would crush the very hills and rocks about him and bury him beneath an avalanche of golden quartz. He ran in panic for an hour perhaps, scrambling over little ravines, falling into a crevice, climbing out and running again. At last, with his feet torn and bleeding, he threw himself to the ground, utterly exhausted. After a time, with returning strength, the Very Young Man began to think more calmly. He was lost, lost in size, the one thing that the doctor, when they started down into the ring, had warned them against so earnestly. What a fool he had been to run! He was miles away from them now. He could not make himself larger, and were they to get smaller, small enough to see him, they might wander in this barren wilderness for days and never chance to come upon him. The Very Young Man cursed himself for a fool. Why hadn't he kept some of the enlarging drug with him? And then abruptly he realized something additionally terrifying. The dose of the diminishing drug which he had just taken so thoughtlessly was the last that remained in that vial. He was utterly helpless. Thousands of miles of rocky country surrounded him, a wilderness devoid of vegetation, of water, and of life. Lying prone upon the ground, which at last had stopped expanding, the Very Young Man gave himself up to terrified reflection. So this was the end. All the dangers they had passed through, their conquests, and the journey out of the ring so near to a safe ending. And then this. For a time the Very Young Man abandoned hope. There was nothing to do, of course. They could never find him. Probably, with women and a child among them, they would not dare even to try. They would go safely back to their own world, but he, Jack Bruce, would remain in the ring. He laughed with bitter cynicism at the thought. Even the habitable world of the ring itself was denied him. Like a lost soul, poised between two worlds, he was abandoned, waiting helpless until hunger and thirst would put an end to his sufferings. Then the Very Young Man thought of Aura, and with the thought came a new determination not to give up hope. He stood up and looked about him, steeling himself against the flood of despair that again was almost overwhelming. He must return as nearly as possible to the point where he had parted from his friends. It was the only chance he had remaining, to be close enough so if one or all of them had become small they would be able to see him. There was little to choose of direction in the desolate waste around, but dimly the Very Young Man recalled having a low line of hills behind him when he was running. He faced that way now. He had come perhaps 6 or 7 miles. He would return now as nearly as possible over the same route. He selected a gully that seemed to wind in that general direction, and climbing down into it, started off along its floor. The gully was some 40 feet deep, and seemed to average considerably wider. Its sides were smooth and precipitous in some places, in others they were broken. The Very Young Man had been walking some 30 minutes when, as he came abruptly around a sharp bend, he saw before him the most terrifying object he had ever beheld. He stood stock still, fascinated with horror. On the floor of the gully, directly in front of him, lay a gigantic lizard, a reptile, hideous, grotesque in its enormity. It was lying motionless, with its jaw, longer than his own body, flat on the ground, as though it were sunning itself. Its tail, motionless also, wound out behind it. It was a reptile that, by its size, it seemed to the Very Young Man at least 30 feet long, might have been a dinosaur reincarnated out of the dark, mysterious ages of the earth's formation. And yet, even in that moment of horror, the Very Young Man recognized it for what it was, the tiny lizard the Chemist had sent into the valley of the Scratch to test his drug. At the sight of the Very Young Man, the reptile raised its great head. Its tongue licked out hideously. Its huge eyes stared unblinking. And then, slowly, hastelessly, it began coming forward, its great feet scratching on the rocks, its tail sliding around a boulder behind it. The Very Young Man waited no longer, but turning, ran back headlong the way he had come. Curiously enough, this new danger, though it terrified, did not confuse him. It was a situation demanding physical action, and with it he found his mind working clearly. He leaped over a rock, half stumbled, recovered himself, and dashed onward. A glance over his shoulder showed him the reptile coming around the bend in the gully. It slid forward, crawling over the rocks without effort, still hastelessly, as though leisurely to pick up this prey which it knew could not escape it. The gully here chanced to have smooth, almost perpendicular sides. The Very Young Man saw that he could not climb out, and even if he could, he knew that the reptile would go up the sides as easily as along the floor. It had been over 100 feet from him when he first saw it. Now it was less than half that distance, and gaining rapidly. For an instant the Very Young Man slackened his flight. To run on would be futile. The reptile would overtake him any moment. Even now he knew that with a sudden spring it could land upon him. A cross rift at right angles in the wall came into sight, a break in the rocks, as though it had been riven apart by some gigantic wedge. It was as deep as the gully itself, and just wide enough to admit the passage of the Very Young Man's body. He darted into it, and heard behind him the spring of the reptile as it landed at the entrance to the rift into which its huge size barred it from advancing. The Very Young Man stopped, panting for breath. He could just turn about between the enclosing walls. Behind him, outside in the gully, the lizard lay baffled, and then, seemingly without further interest, it moved away. The Very Young Man rested. The danger was past. He could get out of the rift, doubtless, further ahead, without re-entering the gully, and if he kept well away from the reptile, probably it would not bother him. Exultation filled the Very Young Man, and then again he remembered his situation, lost in size, helpless, without the power to rejoin his friends. He had escaped death in one form, only to confront it again in another, worse perhaps, since it was the more lingering. Ahead of him the rift seemed ascending and opening up. He followed it, and in a few hundred yards was again on the broken plateau above, level now with the top of the gully. The winding gully itself the Very Young Man could see plainly. Its nearest point to him was some 600 feet away, and in its bottom he knew that hideous reptile lurked. He shuddered and turned away, instinctively walking quietly, fearing to make some noise that might again attract its attention to him. And then came a sound that drove the blood from his face and turned him cold all over. From the depths of the gully, in another of its bends near by, the sound of an anxious girl's voice floated upwards. "Jack! Oh, Jack!" And again, "Jack, my friend, Jack!" It was Aura, his own size perhaps, in the gully, searching for him. With frantic, horrified haste, the Very Young Man ran towards the top of the gully. He shouted warningly as he ran. Aura must have heard him, for her voice changed from anxiety to a glad cry of relief. He reached the top of the gully. At its bottom, 40 feet below, down its precipitous side, stood Aura, looking up, radiant, to greet him. "I took the drug," she cried. "I took it before they could forbid me. They are waiting up there for us. There is no danger now, Jack." The Very Young Man tried to silence her. A noise down the gully made him turn. The gigantic reptile appeared round the nearby bend. It saw the girl and scuttled forward, rattling the loose boulders beneath its feet as it came. Aura saw it the same instant. She looked up helplessly to the Very Young Man above her, then she turned and ran down the gully. The Very Young Man stood transfixed. It was a sheer drop of 40 feet or more to the gully floor beneath him. There was seemingly nothing he could do in those few terrible seconds, and yet, with subconscious, instinctive reasoning, he did the one and only thing possible. A loose mass of jagged gold quartz hung over the gully wall. Frantically he tore at it, pried loose with feet and hands a boulder that hung poised. As the lizard approached, the loosened rock slid forward and dropped squarely onto the reptile's broad back. It was a boulder nearly as large as the Very Young Man himself, but the gigantic reptile shook it off, writhing and twisting for an instant, and hurling the smaller loose rocks about the floor of the gully with its struggles. The Very Young Man cast about for another missile, but there were none at hand. Aura, at the confusion, had stopped about 200 feet away. "Run!" shouted the Very Young Man. "Hide somewhere! Run!" The lizard, momentarily stunned, recovered swiftly. Again it started forward, seemingly now as alert as before. And then, without warning, in the air above his head, the Very Young Man heard the rush of gigantic wings. A tremendous gray body swooped past him and into the gully, a bird larger in proportion than the lizard itself. It was the little sparrow the Chemist had sent in from the outside world, maddened now by thirst and hunger, which to the reptile had been much more endurable. The Very Young Man, shouting again to Aura to run, stood awestruck, watching the titanic struggle that was raging below him. The great lizard rose high on its forelegs to meet this enemy. Its tremendous jaws opened and snapped closed, but the bird avoided them. Its huge claws gripped the reptile's back. Its flapping wings spread the 60-foot width of the gully as it strove to raise its prey into the air. The roaring of these enormous wings was deafening. The wind from them, as they came up, tore past the Very Young Man in violent gusts, and as they went down, the suction of air almost swept him over the brink of the precipice. He flung himself prone, clinging desperately to hold his position. The lizard thrashed and squirmed. A swish of its enormous tail struck the gully wall and brought down an avalanche of loose golden rock. But the giant bird held its grip. Its bill, so large that the Very Young Man's body could easily have lain within it, pecked ferociously at the lizard's head. It was a struggle to the death, an unequal struggle, though it raged for many minutes with an uncanny fury. At last, dragging its adversary to where the gully was wider, the bird flapped its wings with freedom of movement and laboriously rose into the air. A moment later the Very Young Man, looking upward, saw through the magic diminishing glass of distance a little sparrow of his own world with a tiny, helpless lizard struggling in its grasp. "Aura, don't cry! Aura, gosh, I don't want you to cry. Everything's all right now." The Very Young Man sat awkwardly beside the frightened girl, who, overcome by the strain of what she had been through, was crying silently. It was strange to see Aura crying. She had always been such a Spartan, so different from any other girl he had ever known. It confused him. "Don't cry, Aura," he repeated. He tried clumsily to soothe her. He wanted to thank her for what she had done in risking her life to find him. He wanted to tell her 1,000 tender things that sprang into his heart as he sat there beside her. But when she raised her tear-stained face and smiled at him bravely, all he said was: "Gosh, that was some fight, wasn't it? It was great of you to come down after me, Aura. Are they waiting for us up there?" And then, when she nodded: "We'd better hurry, Aura. How can we ever find them? We must have come miles from where they are." She smiled at him quizzically through her tears. "You forget, Jack, how small we are. They are waiting on the little ledge for us. And all this country," she spread her arms toward the vast wilderness that surrounded them, "this is all only a very small part of that same ledge on which they are standing." It was true, and the Very Young Man realized it at once. Aura had both drugs with her. They took the one to increase their size, and without mishap, or moving from where they were, rejoined those on the little ledge who were so anxiously awaiting them. For half an hour the Very Young Man recounted his adventure, with praises of Aura that made the girl run to her sister to hide her confusion. Then once more the party started its short climb out of the valley of the scratch. In 10 minutes they were all safely on the top, on the surface of the ring at last. End of chapter 39. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Adventurer's Return. The Banker, lying huddled in his chair in the clubroom, awoke with a start. The ring lay at his feet, a shining golden band, gleaming brightly in the light as it lay upon the black silk handkerchief. The Banker shivered a little, for the room was cold. Then he realized he had been asleep and looked at his watch. 3 o'clock. They had been gone 7 hours, and he had not taken the ring back to the museum, as they had told him to. He rose hastily to his feet. Then, as another thought struck him, he sat down again, staring at the ring. The honk of an automobile horn in the street outside aroused him from his reverie. He got to his feet and mechanically began straightening up the room, packing up the several suitcases. Then, with obvious awe and a caution that was almost ludicrous, he fixed the ring in its frame within the valise prepared for it. He lighted the little light in the valise, and every moment or two went back to look searchingly down at the ring inside. When everything was packed, the Banker left the room, returning in a moment with 2 of the club attendants. They carried the suitcases outside, the Banker himself gingerly holding the bag containing the ring. "A taxi," he ordered when they were at the door. Then he went to the desk, explaining that his friends had left earlier in the evening and that they had finished with the room. To the taxi driver he gave a number, that was not the museum address, but that of his own bachelor apartment on Park Avenue. It was still raining as he got into the taxi. He held the valise tightly on his lap, looking into it occasionally and gruffly ordering the chauffeur to drive slowly. In the sumptuous living room of his apartment he spread the handkerchief on the floor under the center electrolier and laid the ring upon it. Dismissing the astonished and only half awake butler with a growl, he sat down in an easy chair facing the ring, and in a few minutes more was again fast asleep. In the morning when the maid entered he was still sleeping. 2 hours later he rang for her and gave tersely a variety of orders. These she and the butler obeyed with an air that plainly showed that they thought their master had taken leave of his senses. They brought him his breakfast and a bathrobe and slippers, and the butler carried in a mattress and a pair of blankets, laying them with a sigh on the hardwood floor in a corner of the room. Then the banker waved them away. He undressed, put on his bathrobe and slippers, and sat down calmly to eat his breakfast. When he had finished, he lighted a cigar and sat again in his easy chair, staring at the ring, engrossed with his thoughts. 3 days he would give them, 3 days to be sure they had made the trip successfully. Then he would take the ring to the museum, and every Sunday he would visit it until they came back, if they ever did. The banker's living room, with its usually perfect appointments, was in thorough disorder. His meals were still being served him there by his dismayed servants. The mattress still lay in the corner. On it the rumpled blankets showed where he had been sleeping. For the 100th time during his long vigil, the banker, still wearing his dressing gown and slippers, and needing a shave badly, put his face down close to the ring. His heart leaped into his throat. His breath came fast, for along the edge of the ring a tiny line of figures was slowly moving. He looked closer, careful lest his labored breathing blow them away. He saw they were human forms, little upright figures, 1/8 of an inch or less in height, moving slowly along one behind the other. He counted 9 of them. 9, he thought, with a shock of surprise. Why, only 3 had gone in. Then they had found Rogers and were bringing him and others back with him. Relief from the strain of many hours surged over the banker. His eyes filled with tears. He dashed them away, and thought how ridiculous a feeling it was that possessed him. Then suddenly his head felt queer. He was afraid he was going to faint. He rose unsteadily to his feet and threw himself full length upon the mattress in the corner of the room. Then his senses faded. He seemed hardly to faint, but rather to drift off into an involuntary but pleasant slumber. With returning consciousness, the banker heard in the room a confusion of many voices. He opened his eyes. The doctor was sitting on the mattress beside him. The banker smiled and parted his lips to speak, but the doctor interrupted him. "Well, old friend," he cried heartily, "what happened to you? Here we are, back all safely." The banker shook his friend's hand with emotion. Then, after a moment, he sat up and looked about him. The room seemed full of people, strange-looking figures in extraordinary costumes, dirty and torn. The Very Young Man crowded forward. "We got back, sir, didn't we?" he said. The banker saw he was holding a young girl by the hand, the most remarkable-looking girl the banker thought that he had ever beheld. Her single garment, hanging short of her bare knees, was ragged and dirty. Her jet black hair fell in tangled masses over her shoulders. "This is Aura," said the Very Young Man. His voice was full of pride, his manner ingenuous as a child's. Without a trace of embarrassment, the girl smiled, and with a pretty little bending of her head, held down her hand to the astonished banker, who sat speechless upon his mattress. Loto pushed forward.
"That's mamita over there," he said, pointing. "Her name is Lylda. She's Aura's sister." The Banker recovered his wits. "Well, and who are you, little man?" he asked with a smile. "My name is Loto," the little boy answered earnestly. "That's my father," and he pointed across the room to where the Chemist was coming forward to join them. End of Chapter 40. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The First Christmas. Christmas Eve in a little village of northern New York. A white Christmas, clear and cold. In the dark blue black of the sky, the glittering stars were spread thick, the brilliant moon poured down its silver light over the whiteness of the sloping rooftops, and upon the ghostly white, silently drooping trees. A heaviness hung in the frosty air, a stillness broken only by the tinkling of sleigh bells, or sometimes by the merry laughter of the passers-by. At the outskirts of the village, a little back from the road, a farmhouse lay snuggled up between two huge apple trees, an old-fashioned, rambling farmhouse with a steeply pitched roof, piled high now with snow. It was brilliantly lighted this Christmas Eve, its lower windows sending forth broad yellow beams of light over the whiteness of the ground outside. In one of the lower rooms of the house, before a huge blazing log fire, a woman and four men sat talking. Across the room, at a table, a little boy was looking at a picture book by the light of an oil lamp. The woman made a striking picture as she sat back at ease before the fire. She was dressed in a simple black evening dress, such as a lady of the city would wear. It covered her shoulders, but left her throat bare. Her features, particularly her eyes, had a slight Oriental cast, which the mass of very black hair coiled on her head accentuated. Yet she did not look like an Oriental, nor indeed like a woman of any race of this earth. Her cheeks were red, the delicate diffused red of perfect health, but underneath the red there lay a curious mixture of other colors, not only on her cheeks, but particularly noticeable on her neck and arms. Her skin was smooth as a pearl. In the mellow firelight it glowed with the iridescence of a shell. The four men were dressed in the careless negligee of city men in the country. They were talking gaily now among themselves. The woman spoke seldom, staring dreamily into the fire. A clock in another room struck 8. The woman glanced over to where the child sat, absorbed with the pictures in his book. The page at which he was looking showed a sleigh loaded with toys, with a team of reindeers and a jolly, fat, white-bearded, red-jacketed old man driving the sleigh over the chimney tops. "Come, Loto, little son," the woman said. "You hear? It is the time of sleep for you." The boy put down his book reluctantly and went over to the fireplace, standing beside his mother with an arm about her neck. "Oh, mamita dear, will he surely come, this Santa Claus? He never knew about me before. Will he surely come?" Lylda kissed him tenderly. "He will come, Loto, every Christmas Eve, to you and to all the other children of this great world will he always come." "But you must be asleep when he comes, Loto," one of the men admonished. "Yes, my father, that I know," the boy answered gravely. "I will go now." "Come back, Loto, when you have undressed," the Chemist called after him as he left the room. "Remember, you must hang your stocking." When they were left alone, Lylda looked at her companions and smiled. "His first Christmas," she said. "How wonderful we are going to make it for him." "I can remember so well," the Big Business Man remarked thoughtfully. "When they first told me there was no Santa Claus, I cried, for I knew Christmas would never be the same to me." "Loto is nearly 12 years old," the Doctor said. "Just imagine having his first Christmas." "We're going to make it a corker," said the Banker. "Where's the tree? We got one?" "In the woodshed," Lylda answered. "He has not seen it. I was so very careful." They were silent a moment. Then, "My room is chock full of toys," the Banker said reflectively. "But this is a rotten town for candy canes. They only had little ones." And they all laughed. "I have a present for you, Lylda," the Chemist said after a moment. "Oh, but you must not give it until to morrow. You yourself have told me that." The Chemist rose. "I want to give it to you now," he said, and left the room. In a moment he returned, carrying a mahogany pedestal under one arm and a square parcel in the other. He set the pedestal upright on the floor in a corner of the room, and began opening the package. It was a mahogany case, cubical in shape. He lifted its cover, disclosing a glass bell set upon a flat mahogany slab. Fastened to the center of this was a handsome black plush case, in which lay a gold wedding ring. Lylda drew in her breath sharply and held it. The three other men stared at the ring in amazement. The Chemist was saying, "And I decided not to destroy it, Lylda, for your sake. There is no air under this glass cover. The ring is lying in a vacuum, so that nothing can come out of it and live. It is quite safe for us to keep it this way. I thought of this plan afterwards and decided to keep the ring for you." He set the glass bell upon the pedestal. Lylda stood before it, bending down close over the glass. "You give me back my world," she breathed. Then she straightened up, holding out her arms towards the ring. "My birthplace, my people, they are safe." And then abruptly she sank to her knees and began softly sobbing. Loto called from upstairs, and they heard him coming down. Lylda went back hastily to the fire. The Chemist pushed a large chair in front of the pedestal, hiding it from sight. The boy in his night clothes stood on the hearth beside his mother. "There is the stocking, mamita. Where shall I hang it?" "First a prayer, Loto. Can you remember?" The child knelt on the hearth with his head in his mother's lap. "Now I lay me." He began softly, halting over the unfamiliar words. Lylda's fingers stroked his brown curly head as it nestled against her knees. The firelight shone golden in his tousled curls. The Chemist was watching them with moist eyes. "His first Christmas," he murmured, and smiled a little tender smile. "His first Christmas." The child was finishing. "And God bless Aura and Jack and Grandfather Rio," his mother prompted softly. "And Grandfather Rio and mamita and " the boy ended with a rush. "And me too, amen. Now where do I hang the stocking, mother?" In a moment the little stocking dangled from a mantel over the fireplace. "You are sure he will come?" the child asked anxiously again. "It is certain, Loto, if you are asleep." Loto kissed his mother and shook hands solemnly with the men, a grave, dignified little figure. "Good night, Loto," said the Big Business Man. "Good night, sir. Good night, my father. Good night, mamita. I shall be asleep very soon." And with a last look at the stocking he ran out of the room. "What a Christmas he will have," said the Banker a little huskily. A girl stood in the doorway that led into the dining room adjoining, a curious looking girl in a gingham apron and cap. Lylda looked up. "Oh, Eena, please will you say to Oteo we want the tree from the woodshed in the dining room?" The little maid hesitated. Her mistress smiled and added a few words in foreign tongue. The girl disappeared. "Every window gets a holly wreath," the Doctor said. "They're in a box outside in the woodshed." "Look what I've got," said the Big Business Man, and produced from his pocket a little folded object which he opened triumphantly into a long serpent of filigree red paper on a string with little red and green paper bells hanging from it. "Across the doorway," he added, waving his hand. A moment after there came a stamping of feet on the porch outside, and then the banging of an outer door. A young man and girl burst into the room, kicking the snow from their feet and laughing. The youth carried two pair of ice skates slung over his shoulder. As he entered the room, he flung them clattering to the floor. The girl, even at first glance, was extraordinarily pretty. She was small and very slender of build. She wore stout, high-laced tan shoes, a heavy woolen skirt that fell to her shoe tops, and a short, belted coat with a high collar buttoned tight about her throat. She was covered now with snow. Her face and locks of hair that strayed from under her knitted cap were soaking wet. "He threw me down," she appealed to the others. "I didn't. She fell." "You did. Into the snow you threw me, off the road," she laughed. "But I am learning to skate." "She fell 3 times," said her companion accusingly. "Twice only it was," the girl corrected. She pulled off her cap, and a great mass of black hair came tumbling down about her shoulders. Lylda, from her chair before the fire, smiled mischievously. "Aura, my sister," she said in a tone of gentle reproof, "so immodest it is to show all that hair." The girl, in confusion, began gathering it up. "Don't let her tease you, Aura," said the Big Business Man. "It's very beautiful hair." "Where's Loto?" asked the Very Young Man, pulling off his hat and coat. "In bed. See his stocking there?" A childish treble voice was calling from upstairs. "Good night, Aura. Good night, my friend Jack." "Good night, old man. See you tomorrow," the Very Young Man called back in answer. "You mustn't make so much noise," the Doctor said reprovingly. "He'll never get to sleep." "No, you mustn't," the Big Business Man agreed. "Tomorrow's a very big day for him." "Some Christmas," commented the Very Young Man, looking around. "Where's the holly and stuff?" "Oh, we've got it all right, don't you worry," said the Banker. "And mistletoe," said Lylda, twinkling. "For you, Jack." Eena again stood in the doorway and said something to her mistress. "The tree is ready," said Lylda. The Chemist rose to his feet. "Come on, everybody. Let's go trim it." They crowded gaily into the dining room, leaving the Very Young Man and Aura sitting alone by the fire. For some time they sat silent, listening to the laughter of the others trimming the tree. The Very Young Man looked at the girl beside him as she sat staring into the fire. She had taken off her heavy coat, and her figure seemed long and very slim in the clothes she was wearing now. She sat bending forward, with her hands clasped over her knees. The long line of her slender arm and shoulder, and the delicacy of her profile turned toward him, made the Very Young Man realize anew how fragile she was, and how beautiful. Her massive hair was coiled in a great black pile on her head, with a big loose knot low at the neck. The iridescence of her skin gleamed under the flaming red of her cheeks. Her lips, too, were red, with the smooth, rich red of coral. The Very Young Man thought with a shock of surprise that he had never noticed before that they were red. In the ring there had been no such color. In the room adjoining, his friends were proposing a toast over the Christmas punch bowl. The Chemist's voice floated in through the doorway. "To the Oroids, happiness to them." Then for an instant there was silence as they drank the toast. Aura met the Very Young Man's eyes and smiled a little wanly. "Happiness to them, I wonder. We who are so happy tonight, I wonder, are they?" The Very Young Man leaned towards her. "You are happy, Aura?" The girl nodded, still staring wistfully into the fire. "I want you to be," the Very Young Man added simply, and fell silent. A blazing log in the fire twisted and rolled to one side. The crackling flames leaped higher, bathing the girl's drooping little figure in their golden light. The Very Young Man, after a time, found himself murmuring familiar lines of poetry. His memory leaped back. A boat sailing over a silent summer lake, underneath the stars, the warmth of a girl's soft little body touching his, her hair twisted about his fingers, the thrill in his heart He felt it now as his lips formed the words. "The stars would be your pearls upon a string, the world a ruby for your finger ring, and you could have the sun and moon to wear if I were king." "You remember, Aura, that night in the boat?" Again the girl nodded. "I shall learn to read it some day," she said eagerly. "And all the others that you told me. I want to. They sing so beautifully." A sleigh passed along the road outside. The jingle of its bells drifted into them. The Very Young Man reached over and gently touched the girl's hand. Her fingers closed over his with an answering pressure. His heart was beating fast. "Aura," he said earnestly, "I want to be king for you this first Christmas and always. I want to give you all there is in this life of happiness that I can give just for you." The girl met his gaze with eyes that were melting with tenderness. "I love you, Aura," he said softly. "I love you too, Jack," she whispered, and held her lips up to his. End of Chapter 41. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings.